Hello and welcome to Hazard and Hope. I'm Ed, and in this episode we're going to be looking at how to design and adapt a property to be flood resistant. So here we go. This episode of Hazard and Hope is sponsored by Yorkshire Flood Resilience. So first and foremost, what do we mean by flood resistance and why is it needed? Well, essentially flood resistance measures at the property level can help to restrict water entry into a building and minimise the huge amount of the damage and disruption to properties and people's lives that floods can cause. Flood resistance is one of a range of approaches within the remit of property flood resilience, also known as PFR. Now, in terms of guidance in this area, the Code of Practice for Property Flood Resilience is crucial to be aware of, and you can check out the episode that we've made about it here. We've also put the link to the Code of Practice just below the video. And it essentially sets out the key process and standards through which we should be undertaking PFR in relation to both new build and existing contexts. And it applies to both residential and commercial contexts and for multiple as well as single buildings. Now, in this episode, we're going to be looking at flood resistance measures, but we have also made an episode on flood recoverable approaches that you can check out here, which actually looks at the ways in which we can design a property so that if or when floodwater comes inside it, that there's minimal damage to the building's fabric or its contents. We're also making an episode on avoidance-based approaches for PFR, and that includes things like raising floor levels, changing the location of habitable areas, or even adjusting the vertical or horizontal position of the building itself. But back to flood resistance. Now, the Code of Practice defines it as the use of materials and approaches to manage water entry into the property. So as I said, this approach really is about excluding water entry, and that can be done through things like flood doors or deployable flood barriers. First and foremost though, a couple of disclaimers about this approach. Okay, so it's not necessarily going to be suited for every construction type or flood risk context, and the performance of any measures will of course be reliant on them being correctly specified, installed, managed and maintained over time. But really many of the measures that we're discussing can be incredibly effective at helping to prevent and slow the rate at which floodwater enters a building. As you can see here, there are many different ways in which floodwater can enter a property. I mean, it doesn't just have to be through the front door, it can seep in through party walls, surcharge through drainage systems and rise up from beneath the building. And if any one of these hasn't been addressed, then it can lead to the strategy being undermined and the property flooded. So first of all, I'm going to go through the different types of flood resistant measures that are out there, and then I'll discuss the process and key questions to consider when selecting a particular approach. So what types of flood resistance measures are there? Well, first of all, there are ways to make the perimeter of a site or area flood resistant and help to protect a property from flooding that way. This can include measures such as permanent flood walls, deployable barriers, and these might be framed or self-deployable. However, it's important to be aware that these types of external perimeter protection measures can push the problem elsewhere. They can take time to construct and assemble and may need to be built with appropriate structure or foundations, and they can be flooded from behind. But in this episode, we're going to primarily focus on resistance measures for the property itself. And when you think about ways in which floodwater could enter a building, there are a number of different ways in which we can protect these different apertures. For example, you've got things like flood doors, which look like a normal door, but are designed to help restrict water entry up to a given depth. There are also a range of different types of deployable barriers. Now, these can vary in size and width of material, and it can be single objects, such as large solid barriers that can be clipped into place or dropped into mounting brackets, or they may actually be made up of multiple repeated elements, such as individual boards that are slotted into a housing. The mounting systems can vary, but they're typically fitted onto the external face of the aperture, such as a doorway, but you can also get ones that are actually wound and expand in place to adapt and fit the internal breadth of a given opening. There are also mechanical and automated types of deployable barriers, such as ones which rise from the floor, hinged ones, and roller barriers that can come down from above. What's important to consider with these is that there really isn't anything which is obstructing the deployment of them. Now, flood barrier products on a property can typically restrict floodwaters to depths of 30 to 60 centimetres, and there are ones which do work to higher levels, but beyond that level, the amount of hydrostatic and hydrodynamic loading on a building can be significant, and so it can be safer to actually let the water in and rely on the property being flood recoverable. However, there are resistance measures such as flood skirts, which can actually hold water depths out up to about 1.2 meters. But their performance is of course dependent on them being used in an appropriate context and on properties where the structural reinforcement of the walls can be required to cope with the significant forces that are at play at those depths. You can also specify flood resistant windows, which typically have non-openable glazing at lower levels, but remember that there can be some very large elements of debris that are picked up and carried by floodwater, and it could be trees or cars, and that when they're smashing into the different windows and openings, there can be significant forces at play. So you may choose to actually block up an opening and raise it to a slightly higher level just to reduce that risk. Now, as well as openings in the properties and walls, floodwater can of course come in through air bricks at lower level. And in terms of resistance measures for these, there are a number of different products to consider. So you can use manual covers that you actually clip on before a flood. You can also get these for things like weep holes to stop water getting into a cavity wall. Or it might be that you actually specify and fit an automatic air brick, which actually closes as floodwater rises, but these do need to be cleaned and maintained as debris and even cobwebs can cause them to remain partially open and reduce the effectiveness of their performance. Now, another resistance measure to consider is non-return valves. And these can be fitted to the drainage and water channels for things like washing machines, showers, sinks, and they enable the one-directional flow of water, which essentially helps to limit the amount of floodwater that can surcharge and backflow through a system. But it can also be that you fit things like bungs to toilets to act as a sort of second line of defence and extra resistance measure. Now, given that floodwater can penetrate a property through cracks in mortar or absorption through the material itself, it can also make sense to treat the external building envelope with sealant or flood-resistant renders. Now, sandbags are of course another type of flood resistance measure, but be aware that they can be unstable and leak if not built correctly. They can take time to fill and construct, although modern non-sand versions are available and will actually expand on contact with water. And post-flood, they do require appropriate disposal to avoid contaminating the surrounding ecosystems. With any of these types of measures, there can and always will be a degree of leakage, so the last measure to mention is actually pump and sump systems. Now, these aren't strictly preventing water entry as such, but they can be vitally important to be used in conjunction with resistance measures, as they'll help to get any water out that has come within the building. And it's really crucial to specify the right size and number of pumps and consider where they're positioned in the building and the location of the potential outflow. Where possible, there should be a backup power system, so that might be a generator, but power cuts can occur in the event of a flood, and you can also get flood alerts and alarms that will actually send you a text and let you know if and when that sump and pump has been activated. Now, there are of course new products being developed all the time, but that's just an overview of some of the different types of flood resistance measures that are out there at the moment. And whilst it's tempting to kind of cherry pick and mix and match potential measures, as I mentioned earlier, not all house types and flood risk contexts will be suited for resistance measures. So when considering options, there needs to be a rigorous understanding of the flood hazard and the property setup as it's set out in the Code of Practice. And this is vital information as it helps to inform the specific types of PFR strategies that could be suited. And there are many forces that are at play when a property floods. Now, each type of flooding will have different characteristics and vary in terms of its rate of onset, duration, frequency, the depth, and the types of debris that are actually carried within it. And understanding the potential frequency and severity of flood depths can help inform an appropriate height for flood resistance measures to provide protection up to. And choosing these thresholds is important, as you also need to bear in mind what the future flood risk context could be and actually how much change to allow for. Next, it's important to review which building elements or apertures on the building could actually require protection. And that goes back into understanding and identifying the potential points of water ingress. Key factor to consider is of course what the building is made of and whether external wall finishes will be actually suited to resist floodwater for prolonged flood durations. And you do also need to consider whether the property type is actually suited for resistance-based approaches. So is it detached or is it part of a terrace? I mean, it can make sense for PFR strategies to be undertaken in conjunction with neighbouring properties, so the design strategy actually works on them as an individual unit rather than floodwater flowing between party walls. So context is key, but we do also need to be aware that on many properties there can have been extensive alterations and extensions made over time. And these can be weak points which could potentially undermine a resistance-based approach. And planning and conservation policies can also limit the type of resistance measures that are able to be used on or around a property. So flood walls, for example, can require planning permission and even modelling to be sure that it's not pushing the problem elsewhere and that they function correctly. And if it is agreed that resistance measures are suitable for your property, for your context, then the next thing to consider is whether they're actually active or passive measures which are specified. So an active flood resistance measure is one that requires somebody to actually manually fit or deploy it, whilst passive measures are fitted into the building already and they work without such interventions. Now, given that flooding can occur at any time of day, night or year, passive measures can be preferable, but it's obviously dependent on the particular circumstances and the user requirements. And those end user preferences are of course vital to understand and inform the specification of PFR. You need to think, will they be able to lift and fit that flood barrier in place if and when need be? It's also important to consider what mechanisms or systems could be put in place to be sure that there's enough advanced warning in order to deploy active measures. And flood alarms can be helpful in that regard, but it can also be useful to have a number of people trained and up to speed on how particular resistance measures need to be fitted. Now, from a style or aesthetics point of view, there are many different types of flood door and flood barrier that are available. And more are coming to the market all the time, but essentially I would say that they don't have to stick out like a sore thumb. There's some nice ones out there. When it comes to the performance of different resistance measures, at the time of recording this episode, there isn't a single industry standard resilience rating as such for PFR, but there are a number of different BSI standards and kite-mark products on the market, and there's a link for more information about these on the description just below this video. But with these types of resistance-based approaches, we also need to consider how somebody would safely evacuate the building before, during and after a flood event. Because some resistance measures may need to remain in place for weeks on end as grounds remain saturated and the floods could come again. And something like a flood door can be particularly effective in these instances, as it's able to be used as a normal door, but in the event of a flood, it's there to perform as a flood door. The selection and specification of resistance measures will of course be influenced and beholden to the cost and the budget available. And over the last few years, flood resistance measures have become much more affordable, and there can be grants available to help with the purchase of different measures. I would say that there's also an increasing movement within the insurance sector to reward resilience. Now, during the construction and commissioning phases of the Code of Practice, there are a number of different steps and checks that are set out to ensure that measures have been correctly installed. I mean, it's optional, but this can also include wet testing, where you actually put a jig around something like a flood door and you fill it with water and check and test the seepage rates. And that awareness of the PFR approach in place needs to be enduring, because if a property was to change hands, the new owners need to be up to speed on why particular materials and measures have been specified, as if they're not, there's really a risk that they could be ripped out and removed or have their performance impaired by other alterations. So as the Code of Practice sets out, a handover pack needs to be passed on to provide this information. And it's not just the bricks and the mortar that will need to be adapted. Any successful PFR setup will need to be operated and maintained in the right way. So with resistance measures, there will need to be regular checks on things like seals and actually the users know where their barriers are stored and how they need to be fitted. And as Katie, who features in one of the Our Flood Resilient Home episodes, put it, if you don't maintain it, that flood door is not a flood door anymore. And that mantra and mindset really applies to the whole remit of PFR. And if there's not been a flood for 10 years, would you know where that flood barrier is stored and how it is fitted, or whether the sump and the pump is still in full working order? But it doesn't have to be a one or the other approach when it comes to resistance and recoverability. I mean, they can be used in conjunction to great effect, and diversity is certainly a key characteristic of resilient design. Because I would say that in any context, there's always going to be a degree of residual risk, and you wouldn't want to necessarily be reliant on the performance of a single threshold to keep your property safe. And as the Code of Practice sets out, resistance measures should be designed to resist floodwater up to an appropriate depth, and include a mechanism to allow for the measure to fail or overtop safely, so that it does not present additional risk to the property or the inhabitants. So in something like a flood door, the letterbox can actually function as a way of letting that floodwater into a property once it reaches the given threshold, and have the interior of the property as flood recoverable so that there's less damage if and when the water comes within. Now, a lot of the discussions so far have been around the idea of retrofitting or upgrading these flood resistance measures onto an existing property, But these can also, of course, be specified and fitted onto new build properties. What I would say though is that we might not expect to see a new build property having its flood resistance measures put to the test by floodwater from day one, as what that could mean is that the property's been poorly located, or that its finished floor levels and habitable areas have been set to the wrong threshold. So why should you make your property more flood resistant? Well, if you look at Sue's episode of Our Flood Resilient Home, the floodboards that she uses help to significantly slow the rate at which floodwater entered within her building. And she's got non-return valves there and a sump and pump in place to get the water out of the building. It was the difference between her home taking 10 months to repair and reinstate at a cost of £70,000 for the insurer and being largely unaffected by the last flood, bar a pot of varnish and some mopping out. That contrast is incredible, and it shows you the value and effectiveness of flood resilient design. So if you think that you'd like to make your property more flood resistant, then what's the next step? Well, the Code of Practice shows the process through which you need to go through. And really the first step is to get advice from a suitable professional on your flood hazard and the property's setup, so they can help inform you of what options may be suitable for your given context and preferences. And if that happens to be that resistance measures aren't appropriate for your context or setup, then you don't lose faith, because there are many other ways in which we can design and adapt properties to be flood resilient and minimise the damage and disruption that floods can cause and speed up any recovery times. So thanks very much for listening, and if you'd like to keep updated on future episodes, please subscribe below, hit the bell for notifications, and we look forward to seeing you soon.